I'm Siobhan Sheridan. I am blessed to be the Civilian HR Director for the Ministry of Defence. So that's my my day job. There's a gentleman called Paul O'Neill kind of hiding behind a column there, who is also from Defence. And Paul and I have spent 4 hours or so this afternoon talking about AI and robotics and technology and all of these things as they apply to all sorts of things. And all of those subject areas are really, really important, and it's absolutely vital as HR professionals that we're on that we understand that. But what I want to do this evening really is to kind of talk about some of the counterpoint to that, which is us as humans. So I invite you to just take a quick check out of the person who's standing next to you and see whether you think they're a real human being. That provoked a lot more fascination than I was expecting. So whether they're a human being or whether you might have accidentally found yourself standing next to a zombie. Now I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in due course. So for those of you who don't know me, my background's a little bit eclectic as well. So I spent 20 years working in the financial services sector. I then moved to work for a government organisation called DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or the Department for Floods, Plagues and Pestilence, as I like to call it, because that's broadly what it does. Then I had the great pleasure of being the HR Director for the Job Centre Plus network. I moved from there to work for the NSPCC, which is a children's charity, as their People Director, and I'm now back in the bosom of the civil service and thoroughly enjoying it. So why is that relevant? Because actually a part of what I'm getting up to in life is trying to demonstrate that HR careers can move across sectors. And that you don't go to the charity sector at the end of your career, and I unapologetically talk to everybody that I speak to about this, that actually it is possible, and one of the great blessings for us as HR professionals is that we can go and work anywhere. We can take our trade and our tools and we can go and work anywhere. And the really important thing in doing that is that we take our humanity with us. So with that in mind, can I just check out who we've got in the room? So who actually is prepared to somebody put their hands up and say, I am an HR professional? Yeah, we got some of those. Anybody think there's some other kind of a professional? Anybody really confused at this point about what they actually? I am. I'm sometimes really confused. Who have we got who's in the private sector? Private sector people? Yeah, they are lovely people. Don't believe any of the things put about by the charity sector that say that the private sector are bad people. Public sector people? Yeah, public sector, civil service, NHS, police, all of that, yeah. Charity sector people, third sector, not for profit. Working for myself, thanks very much, I'm gigging. Yeah, who knows? Gigging and working for somebody else. Yeah, anybody? Yeah, a few people prepared to admit to that as well. All right, so a bit of a mix in the room. And I think one of the reasons for asking that question about whether or not we really think about ourselves as HR professionals is I've spent the last 2 years studying actually at Ashridge, doing a master's degree at Ashridge, which is a wonderful place if ever you get the opportunity to go there. I'm really looking at what is it that we do as HR professionals. And the study that I was doing was on humanising HR. Now, how did that come about? Why did I do that? Actually, it started in, and I hope for all of those of you who've said that you're HR professionals, that you have some sort of way that you go about reflecting on what you do. So some sort of reflective practice, we might call it. What I noticed when I started reflecting on what it was that I did was that some days I went home really pleased about and happy with the work that I'd done. And some days I went home, and Mark would have been on the receiving end of quite a lot this year, Holly, actually. Some days I went home thinking, do you know what, I really did do my best work there. I'm really not proud of what I did. I'm really not proud of how I came across in that meeting. Maybe I was just slightly off with that person. Maybe actually I didn't run that particular process, that appraisal conversation in the way that I might have done. And what I started to realise was some sort of subtlety in my practice that meant that I wasn't always doing work that I felt really, really, truly proud of. started to dig into that, I came across a man called Ben Yeager. Now, I'm not going to tell you Ben's story tonight, but I'm going to encourage you to go and take a look at it on YouTube. So Ben was an Israeli soldier who was conscripted into the Israeli army and became a peace activist. And Ben's TED Talk is about humanising the enemy. And what Ben talked to me about was the process that he had to go through of realising that he had swallowed a story about the people that he was being asked to hold a gun to the head of. And then actually that wasn't a true story. It wasn't real. But what it was doing was it was enabling him to behave in a particular way. And when I reflected on Ben's story, what I realised was that I too had swallowed an ideology. And that ideology was something that some of you will call Taylorism or scientific management. So it was a form of thinking about organisations that sees organisations as machines and that sees people as cogs in those machines. I actually sat in a meeting today and winced when I heard somebody use the terminology component to talk about human beings. But previously, I wouldn't have winced because I hadn't really thought about the ways in which I was going about referring to people. So I was feeling pretty bad. You know, I've swallowed this ideology. I've kind of gone along with this idea that organisations are machines and not that we can treat people exactly how we want to, because I like to think I've always been a human inside somewhere. But actually that in some ways I've kind of gone along with that. So as I thought about that, I thought, well, why does that happen? And I came across the research of a woman called Siobhan Sheridan. Is anybody here in the NHS or in nursing? Anybody familiar with Siobhan Sheridan's work on psychological defences? No? So Isabel did this work with nurses where she tried to work out why was it that nurses were struggling with some of the work that they were doing. And what she identified was that in certain professions, in certain situations, we find ourselves, and I think this is a beautiful phrase that she uses, we find ourselves trapped between compassion and disgust. And when we find ourselves trapped between compassion and disgust, we have to find a way of psychologically defending ourselves. And the way that nurses go about doing that, she identified, was through things like uniforms and ward rounds and particular ways of doing things and particular routines and processes. Now, at the time that I came across that research, I'd gone to work for the Ministry of Defence. So the Ministry of Defence is a wonderful place with all sorts of amazing people in it, including all of my military colleagues. And when you go, has anybody ever been into a meeting with military people? A military meeting? So when you go into a military meeting, what you'll find is that the table is laid out with a set of nameplates that describe your role title. Not your name, but your role title. So I am DCivHR when I go into a meeting. And people will refer to each other by their role titles. Now again, when you investigate where does that come from with the military, and where that comes from is situations in which they are in theatre as in, in the field of battle. And in that sort of a situation, it's really, really important that they don't get attached to the other human being. I'm sure we can all understand why that is in that sort of an environment. And so they have developed ways of defending their psyche from the overwhelm that comes with that sort of experience, and they do it very well, and I'm massively proud of working alongside those colleagues every day in terms of what they do. So that's their form of psychological defence. So what it made me start wondering about, because initially I looked at that and thought, oh, this is all very bizarre, and they have all these things on their shoulder that say what status they are, and everybody knows what everybody's grade is, and it's all kind of, the power dynamics are all very kind of clear and out there, and isn't that all a little bit awful? And then I thought, actually, no, that's all just a little bit honest. They're actually just more honest than most organisations I've worked in. Because in most other organisations, you go into a meeting and people are checking out what the grade of the person is, what job do they do, who do they work for, who's their sponsor, who do they know, who do they go to school with. But we're just not that honest and open about it. And so it made me realise that all of those things are going on in organisations all of the time. And it made me question, and I'm going to invite you in a little while to question, what were some of my psychological defences? What were some of the ways in which I defended myself, and how did I go about doing that? And the persona of the HR director was actually one of mine. So what I realised was that as I reflected on this, I found myself in certain conversations where it was like the persona of the HR director was there. And then in other conversations, Siobhan was there. And actually there was a distinct difference between those two things. And that was one of the ways in which I was defending myself. So why do we do that? Why do we need to do that in HR? Because actually there's something really important about it. In the same way as I would never ask my military colleagues to stop using their psychological defences, there's a really good reason why we're doing it. And I think the reason we're doing it is really embedded in what Menzies talked about, being trapped between compassion and disgust. So quite often in organisations, we find ourselves, I would suggest, working with processes and systems that we don't really truly believe in. Working with processes and practices that we're not really entirely bought into. So that's one aspect that we find ourselves kind of defending ourselves from. You know, working with this recruitment process, and it's dreadful, isn't it? And it's really kind of dehumanising people, but, well, I've just got to work with it. So then the other thing that happens is that managers in organisations use HR as their form of psychological defence. Yeah? HR says. HR won't let me. It's HR's fault. The number of people I find coming to me every day going, my manager sent me to talk to HR. That's really interesting. Can you go back and talk to your manager? But actually our managers are just something about getting compassionate towards our managers as well. They're just defending themselves against a process that they don't really buy into either. And then the third thing that we find ourselves defending ourselves from is the fact that sometimes we're doing things that are difficult and tricky. And I don't want to kind of bring everybody's Easter bank holiday weekend night out down. You know, but quite often we find ourselves in situations where we're doing things that are hard. They're hard to do, they're hard to deliver. And we don't always find it easy as HR professionals to talk about that. So what do we do about all of that? Because I certainly don't want to depress and demoralise everybody. But I think the first thing is we really need to accept that we're doing a very difficult job. We're quite akin to therapists, actually, in some of the psychological load that we're taking day to day in our work. And there's a lot of developing research going on at the minute. Roger Steer's done some interesting research. The CIPD have done some interesting research that would suggest that the well-being of HR professionals, that the mental health well-being of HR professionals, is lagging the mental health well-being of other types of professionals. And I think that's something we need to care about and we need to be concerned about. And we need to work out how do we look after ourselves in this work. If we're going to stay successfully in HR for a long period of time and looking at all of these smiling, lovely faces, I would hope that you're going to do that, then we need to work out how we sustain ourselves in that situation. So how do we do that? You know, the first thing is realising that this is a human reaction. And it's really, really important that we do take care of ourselves in what we're doing. The second thing is to get really, really interested in it. And I'm going to give you the chance to do that in a second. To start to think about what are some of the things that go on in your organisation? What are some of the phrases that get used? What are some of the ways in which we talk about people? What are some of the ways in which we cope with other human beings? What happens in your organisation? What do you do? And then there's something about how do you find a supportive group of people with whom you can have that conversation on an ongoing basis. A group of people who are going to really get you. A group of people who are going to be prepared to sit with you on the difficult days and have those conversations with you and work out what it is that's going on for you. So all of that, I think, why do I think all of that is important? Because the future of work, and the CIPD keep saying this, and I utterly and completely agree with them, the future of work is still human. And the role of HR is still to understand how humans best work and thrive in the workplace. And absolutely we're going to have to work out how we get humans and machines working together. You know, Paul and I have been talking about human, non-human teams today. You know, we absolutely have to work out how all of that happens. But our expertise, our specialism is in humans and in humanity. So that, I think, continues to be the role that HR needs to bring to the table. And I think what I'm realising at this stage in my career is that when I joined HR in the 80s, I think HR sold its soul at that point. And I think we sold our soul for a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. And I think the prize was getting that seat at the table. And the price was actually not really bringing the contribution, the really valuable contribution to the table that I think HR can bring. And so I'm really delighted to be with a group of people to be able to talk about that tonight. Thank you for giving me the chance to chat that through with you. My invitation to you through your networking is to say, have a chat about what some of this is. How does humanity play out for you? What sorts of defence routines are you running? Who is your support network? Do you have somebody to talk to? How are you feeling right now? What sorts of things are going on in your workplace? So I'd invite you to have a little bit of that conversation. Paul and I, if you want to chat about anything to do with defence, which I realise I haven't talked about an awful lot, there's some very good reasons for not talking about that. We're quite secretive in all sorts of ways, but we are a great bunch of people, really, really happy to chat to you some more. So is that what you were looking for?
That was amazing. I don't know where to even take this now. Does anyone have any questions for Siobhan before we get back to taking up that challenge?
Can I just actually selling
come out from
Well,
behind
just
the
thoughts,
pillar.
yeah. Come on, come up here.
I heard the words. I think I got some of the implicit messages, but I'm not sure I really get what you're saying about HR solve it, get a seat at the table. I'm not comfortable with that.
No,
but I might
neither
be
was I.
persuaded if I
And it might just be me, by the way. So bear in mind, this is my story. It's not anybody else's story. So it might just be me. I think that there was a tendency back then for us to collude with this idea of organisations as machines. And I think what I noticed myself and others around me at the time starting to do was to try and be the analyst, to try and be the numbers person, to try and bring all of that, to be able to speak the language of the business, without necessarily bringing some of the human side of the ethical side. If we look outside at what's going on in the world, at the moment, the Me Too stuff, the Weinstein stuff, all of that stuff, that was going on. We didn't say anything. It wasn't that we didn't know. And yes, absolutely, things have changed and times have changed, and I get all of that, but there were also things that we just didn't speak up about, because I think we really wanted that place, that seat at the table. It's just my story. It's not necessarily what happened for everybody. Please do.
I think it's probably on a similar line. One of the things I was accused of when I was in one of the blue chip companies I worked for was going native, because I was the HRD to the CEO, and I got criticised by my HR community for being more concerned about that part of the business than what else was going on in the broader organisation. I'm not PT here. Shouldn't say that.
Whichever organisation.
So is that what you're alluding to as well?
Yeah, I think a little bit of that going native, although I think the going native dynamic is a bit more difficult, isn't it? Because sometimes there's a kind of a HR for HR's sake versus HR that actually drives the difference for the organisation, and for the people in the organisation. So it can work both ways. But yes, I think in some places it played out in that way. And it will only have been in some places. You've got to bear in mind I was in financial services in the 80s, so it might not have been like that in other places. So, other question?
Just thought myself, so I get completely what you're saying and I can see it, and I've said for a long time, not as well articulated, that there are two roles in HR. Because I do think there is a role for that mechanistic numbers and process and efficiency, and there's a role for being the human side. Do you think we can do both? Do you think people can do both? Because I see people in my teams that are in different camps, which is fine because we blend together.
Yeah.
Can one person, as a HR director or HR whoever, do both?
I think it's a great question for everybody to debate. I'm not sure I've got an answer. And I think saying I don't know is a really important thing to do sometimes. I don't know.
I come to every day and I say, do I need different people? Or
I think one of the challenges sometimes with being an HR director, or in any role in HR, actually, is we're constantly being asked to adjust. I describe it as being asked to adjust our focal length. So you might go from one conversation that's like up here to another conversation that's out there. Similarly, with what we're asked to do in terms of breadth from numbers to people. So I think you're right. It's a big expanse
when you're developing
to
people
travel.
coming into the profession.
On the same line, really, the observation I'll make is that I believe that HR is a very dynamic profession, and it's probably the most complicated profession you could sit with alongside a CEO. So my parallel will be the CEO, because the CEO is over every facet of the organisation. Well, guess what? So is HR.
Yeah.
But it won't be an individual directorate sitting over there or another directorate sitting over there, because they're only concerned about their own operations, whereas HR has got to have the overview, as does the CEO. And almost, you are seen as that go-to department. So whether that would be some sectors encouraging sort of the blame culture or the shield, as I say, let's stand behind HR, it's HR for this and HR for that. Actually, even if you look at it negatively like that, we are giving the organisation making a very, very valuable contribution, because it's the intelligence that we then gather from the softer issues that can form, hopefully, the major dynamic issues that will change, hopefully, the organisation for the better.
Yeah.
So I think whichever guise it's in, whatever we're doing, we're adding value.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that thought promotes for me is the HR director, or indeed many HR roles in the organisation, are also quite lonely, in the same way that the CEO role is quite lonely.
I agree.
Because there isn't always someone for us to go to. I'm really, really lucky in defence, because I have my boss and colleague, Lieutenant General Richard Needy, who's Chief Defence People, and he and I work together really, really closely. And so actually I don't feel that loneliness in the same way that I have done in other organisations, because we do work really closely together on what we're doing. But I think that's another important point. Michelle?
I was just going to say that I can validate the same feeling that you felt, in that I can remember very clearly about to make a presentation and having my boss look at my presentation and saying, "You're going to talk about happiness? Can't we change them to engagement?" And I'm like, no, I want to talk about happiness, right? And oh God, that's just, too provocative. And I don't think any finance person would go in and, about to make a presentation, "You're going to talk about EBITDA?" Well, no. Right? And so I have felt like, all right, and in that case, I won't name the company, but I did change my presentation, and I did talk about engagement, and when I walked out of that meeting, I felt like, man, I just sold out.
Yeah.
Huh? And so I have had those feelings, and I wish I had been stronger, and I wish I had said, no, actually, happiness is what I want to talk about, not engagement.
Yeah.
It's different.
And I think I so get that, Michelle. And one of the things, I keep waxing lyrical about the military, and there are good reasons why I'm waxing lyrical about the military. One of the things I love is, for example, about the military, they don't talk about engagement, they talk about morale. Now, morale makes a lot more sense to me, frankly. I think it makes a lot more sense to a lot of people than this kind of construct that we're not even, we end up debating what it is. So I think there is something about, cutting back to what are we really talking about? And of course, you don't always go in. When I worked at Capital One, if I'd gone into the European executive team talking about, I don't know, at that point, probably even emotional intelligence, I'd have been rooted out of the room. So there are, of course, there are always moments where you say, how do I get this across in a way that makes sense for the organisation that I'm working with? But what I'm suggesting is that we can be aware of what we're doing as we do it, and what, in what ways we might be colluding. Over the back.
I was going to ask, you touched on Me Too
Yeah.
and all of that. Do you see it as a failure of the HR organisation that, there is apparently a need to address this issue? And if that's the case, how do you move forward? Or even if that's not the case, how do you move forward with that?
Yeah, I think that is such a great question. So I think there's a real question. So for me, what I'm looking for and looking at in organisations is, where am I seeing abuse of power? Because I think one of the challenges with some of what's going on at the moment is that we're describing issues in particular ways, and actually there are equally damaging dynamics that just happen not to be. Sexual misconduct, sexual harassment is an issue. And by the way, there are other ways in which people abuse their power that aren't that, and that affect a much wider range of different types of people as well. And so, do I think that HR has? I think we have to ask ourselves questions. I've asked myself those questions. I actually, having talked about European executive team for Capital One. They happened to all come round for dinner the other night, 20 years or 15 years after we'd all worked together. And actually that was the conversation we had. They were saying to me, as an all-male board at the time, were we like that? And so I do think there's something about how do we actually support, what are we doing now in our organisations to support our organisations and individuals in them to be able to look at themselves, to look at now, absolutely to look at the past and the future, but there's something about what are we doing about what's happening now as well. So yes, I think we have got to ask ourselves a question. I don't know of any HR whistleblower yet. And that's kind of peculiar in any of these big, scandals or issues, whatever they are, whether they're Me Too or they're anything else. It's like, where's the HR whistleblower in this? And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we're the conscience of the organisation, because I don't think we should take that responsibility either.
What do you mean by that, Siobhan, out of interest? You mean HR calling out senior management for it's doing something wrong? Is that what you mean?
When I say whistleblower,
Yeah.
or I think I'm meaning literally. We wouldn't necessarily know if there was a protected whistleblowing, but there's kind of a where is the person who was calling out from inside of the organisation, that the practices that are then criticised from outside of the organisation were not as they should have been. And that is a really, really tricky thing to do. I mean, I'd really commend on that front, Megan Wrights out of Ashridge has just written a great report called Speaking Truth to Power. And the reason I like that report is because it actually looks at what's the cost to somebody of speaking out. Because sometimes we talk about this as though, well, it's just obvious, isn't it? You would speak out. Well, actually, if you've got a mortgage to pay and kids to keep in school and everything else, it's not that obvious always. So.
I mean, I know of quite a few cases where HR actually takes side of the business when there are flagrant abuses being called out. I mean, there's public cases in the BBC and where they're actually become at close ranks, even when it's clear something's very, very wrong here from a criminal perspective. But there was also a great piece of research into whistleblowing that was done when companies with whistleblower policies, there's a study, a 4-year, 5-year, multi-year study, and loads of things were going wrong, and people would not call out, even with whistleblower protection. So that says something about humans, that we perhaps are in a position where we really need to think about how we work in groups. And I think there are some fundamental things there that have been going on. To your point, bullying, terrible things, racism, discrimination, happens all the time. Happens all the time. I'm sorry to say.
No.
I don't want to. Let's not end on that note. Keep going. It's fear, coming to your point.
Absolutely, and there's something we have to be able to talk about that, and we especially have to be able to talk about that as a profession, because we've got to support each other to work out how we do that. So,
you did mention about people working in charities, private organizations, public and everything, and by yourself. I was wondering, what do you actually do as an HR person working on your own, if it's not for organization support?
what do you do as an HR person working on your own if you're not working in an organisation? Oh, where are my giggers? Can we answer this question? What kinds of stuff are you doing gigging?
Because I'm a student and I'm actually looking into HR, so just wanted to have perspective.
Some of my gig economy consultants. What do you do?
Well, I'm a gig and part-time entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur, entrepreneur. So I'm working my way through.
Entrepreneur. Come here, entrepreneur. Come here.
I'm right, what was I going to say? If you work alone, if you work as an island, if you're working as someone who's freelance or working as a sole contributor or whatever, for me, the number one thing is networking.
Yeah.
You have to build your network, and all the coaching I do with my HR clients and with people in the organisations that I coach is all about, you might have a role at the moment, or you might be a freelancer or whatever, but if you haven't got a network, it doesn't open a pathway to the next opportunity, someone you can lean on to talk about challenges you've got, etc. So I think if you work alone, or if you are part of an entrepreneurial set of people that are all independent, it's really essential to build your network.
Can
I
that
can
help?
add to that, if I may. It's all about networking, as you said, and then it's about referrals,
Yeah.
and it's about the companies that you work with. I work mainly now as a consultant with SMEs, and they refer me to other companies and say he's done something good for us.
Yeah.
And often I get involved in Bill thumped Fred to sort that out initially, but then once you get in there, you sort of say, okay, well, what are your processes, what are your policies, what's your training, blah, 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 blah. So what you need to do is you need to get into an organisation, get a relationship with an organisation, but we'll talk afterwards, yeah?
Yeah, I think
I sense that's a good segue for a bit of speed networking.
all of our giggers need to come and have a chat. I will take one final question because this lady's had her hand up for ages, and then we will all get networking, I promise.
So as a recent graduate, I'm just starting my career in HR, and I think I just would make a use of an advice from someone like you. You were talking a lot about the defense systems, yes, which I found I could actually relate. I'm on my managerial position right now, and it does happen, yes. So I wanted to ask, how do you deal it with you? How do you do it personally? When you are trapped between that compassionate discussion, or it's just so hard, it will take time, and you're not so sure about you have a skills, but maybe not enough, and so how do you go through this?
Yeah, oh gosh, that's it. I think I'm going to hook up with you on speed networking. Because there's quite a lot to that. Because it's something about what can you change, what's your locus of control, what isn't your locus of control. There's something about how do you understand and uphold your own values. And then there's something about kind of the practical, how do you notice that happening in the moment and be able to shift the way that you're thinking about something as a result of it. So I'll come and find you. But others might have some answers to that as well. So
Well, that sounds like a
we'll
good
have a group over there.
Siobhan, thank you so much. We're so